Ultraman Tiga, the most popular Ultra Series TV show since the 90s. Or, if one should believe a 2022 NHK poll, the most popular Ultra Series TV show ever, at least for the moment. Anyway, there's a lot to talk about with Ultraman Tiga. From introducing the concept of Ultraman changing forms, to the less than ideal treatment it received at the hands of 4 kids for the American market. Though today I'd like to focus on some of the show's unappreciated brilliance, and the person it owes a lot of it to. This individual is not only one of the best of the show's several directors, they can be called the maverick of the show itself. Do you have any ideas on who that could be? Many might be tempted to say Akioji Soji, a well-regarded name among Ultra fans in both the East and the West at this point. Although it's something that has been somewhat diluted by time and the countless works his output has since inspired, the independent-minded young director had an art house, often uniquely thought-provoking approach to telling Tokusatsu stories that set him apart from his peers and has kept him a favorite for ages. Still, while Ultraman Tiga marked Chisoji's return to TV Ultraman for the first time in decades, he is not the focus of this video. This time another star shined brighter. And that would be Kyota Kawasaki, one of the great unsung heroes of late 90s Tokusatsu, who was, fittingly enough, once considered the Akioji Soji of the time. Kawasaki wasn't exactly a newcomer. The relatively young director had a brief stint in Hollywood, where he worked on Honey, I Shrunk the Kids as a production assistant, and, upon his return to Japan, directed episodes 7 and 8 of Lightning's Superhuman Gridman. The latter got his foot in the door at Tsuburaya Productions, the company behind Ultraman, and eventually, a position on Ultraman Tiga. Ultraman Tiga would be his first experience with Ultraman, and, like others of his generation, such as Shinji Higuchi and Keita Amemiya, Kawasaki sought to take the art form higher, and, in pursuit of these lofty ambitions, not only crafted several of Ultraman Tiga's best episodes, but produced some of the finest accomplishments in Tokusatsu. However, in order to understand what made him and Ultraman Tiga such a big deal, it might be worth knowing a little bit about the world in which Ultraman Tiga was made. It was the early 90s, and roughly the last decade of Japanese special effects had been dominated by bright and colorful children's fare. Most of the market was represented either by Toei's TV efforts like Super Sentai and the Fushigi comedy series, or the monopoly Toho held on the theatrical side of things with the Vs. Godzilla series, which had recently been retooled to appeal to families, and was in reality carried by children. Of course, this doesn't mean that more experimental and mature works didn't exist, but generally, those were reserved for home media, or saw very limited theatrical distribution. By the mid-90s, however, there was a shift in talent behind the scenes. The kids of the 1960s and 1970s, raised on classic Tokusatsu film and television like the original Ultraman and early Godzilla features, were now adults eager and able to influence the direction of the art form. They sought the best of both worlds, something mature and thought-provoking, yet accessible to all ages. That said, their work was definitely cut out for them, as Tokusatsu had become the subject of ridicule. Ever since Star Wars raised expectations for special effects, way back in 1977, viewers in both the East and the West had become increasingly unkind to the art form, and Hollywood only continued to raise the bar from there. In the minds of many, Tokusatsu wasn't anything to take seriously. Nevertheless, this new younger generation of talent was determined to challenge these negative perceptions and prove the potential of the art form. This is a fascinating, little-known story in the West that I plan to revisit in more detail another time. Though for now, the event to turn the tide and start what I'll call the 4th Tokusatsu boom was Gamera's very well-regarded revival in 1995, Gamera, Guardian of the Universe. This film flipped the script on what was thought possible with the art form, demonstrating what many thought to be impossible at that time, that Tokusatsu can be home to thoughtful, well-crafted stories and receive positive mainstream attention. You know the type of acclaim Godzilla -1 received in the West recently? That's what Gamera, Guardian of the Universe was met with in Japan, and Ultraman Tiga became one of the first works to capitalize on that momentum. As the first primetime Japanese Ultra Series TV show since Ultraman 80, roughly 15 years earlier, and a complete reboot of the series, Ultraman Tiga was unmistakably a new generation Ultraman. While the basic idea was left unchanged, it's still a show about a team that fights aliens and giant monsters, in this case Guts, and on this team there's a special member, in this case Daigo, who can secretly transform into the title character to lend a helping hand when the going gets too tough. Yet it is very much a product of the 4th Tokusatsu boom and its desire to engage with the material in a more consistently thoughtful, yet accessible fashion. For example, in past shows, Ultraman was often readily accepted as the hero without much in the way of reluctance or questioning. Monsters and aliens alike were often treated as almost ordinary. However, Ultraman Tiga saw something different. It would have a relatively grounded setting, exploring how people respond to larger-than-life entities and situations for the first time. Despite his relative youth compared to other staff and the competitive environment that was the show's production, the 35-year-old Kyota Kawasaki thrives in the pursuit of this and other endeavors, quickly distinguishing himself as a force to be reckoned with, and it's about time he gets Western recognition for those accomplishments. Kawasaki directed 8 of Ultraman Tiga's 52 episodes. Episode 5, The Day When the Monster Appeared. Episode 6, Second Contact. Episode 15, Phantom Dash. Episode 16, The Revived Demon. Episode 27, I Saw Obiko. Episode 28, One Vanishing Moment. Episode 38, The Mirage Monster. And Episode 39, Dear Mr. Ultraman. And as suggested earlier, his episodes are among the most noteworthy of the entire show, especially his last 4. So, let's take a closer look at what Kawasaki brought to the table. Looking at the ideas and themes explored within Kawasaki's episodes wouldn't be a bad place to start, as you could almost always count on something of value whenever he was at the helm. While every idea could not be attributed to him, because there was a different writer attached to just about every episode, Kawasaki took a very hands-on approach to whatever he directed, and what seems to have been an unconventional move given the reaction of the writers. He had no qualms about changing scripts whenever he could, but we'll cross that bridge when we get there. In the meantime, a good place to start would be Kawasaki's first episode, Episode 5, The Day When the Monster Appeared. Working with a screenplay penned by Chiaki Konaka of Serial Experiments Lane and Digimon Tamers fame, Kawasaki's debut does a number of interesting things. First, in an early excellent example of Ultraman Tiga's fundamentally different approach to its worldview compared to those of its predecessors, there is an emphasis on how a giant monster impacts the daily lives of the masses, a real-world, simulation-based interest it shares with the Gamera films from the same time. Rarely did the earlier shows spend much time in this territory beyond the genre staple evacuation scenes. So, while not an exact match, maybe the closest example of the simulation approach prior to Ultraman Tiga is episode 21 of Ultraman Taro. This comparison is not intended to criticize Ultraman Taro or suggest that it is an inferior show. It's a great episode and a fantastic series. The point of this exercise is simply to highlight the different approaches to the material. And with that said, let's begin. Ultraman Taro episode 21 sees citizens complaining about the loud noises of a giant cicada. Crowds form on separate occasions demanding that ZAT, the defense team of the show in question, and law enforcement eliminate the insect. Unimpressed by suggestions that they wait a week for the creature to die on its own, the crowds attack the cicada, and eventually, all hell breaks loose. Despite having some interesting comments about the urbanization happening in Japan at the time, the episode depicts its conflict in simple terms. A lot of the complaints from citizens are rather trivial given the gravity of the situation, and the response from authorities is a little on the unrealistic side of things. For example, the most seen between two perimeters is a couple of ZAT officers in one case, and a single police officer in the other. The episode primarily sticks to what it needs to meet its immediate narrative concerns, and get the monster of the week to start a destructive rampage that Ultraman must stop. In short, real-world implications are an afterthought, compared to the greater attention to detail Ultraman Tiga would bring to the table. With the Ultraman Tiga episode, what is presumed to be the corpse of a monster washes ashore, and emanates a foul odor. The stench is toxic enough to send dozens of people to the hospital and leave several others in a coma, naturally leading to the citizens requesting an immediate removal of the body, and guts being put into action by their parent organization, TPC. From start to finish, the episode offers multiple perspectives on the situation through the use of news crews, TV commentators, journalists, and everyday people weighing in on the crisis, and providing their own unique insight. For instance, the people getting their houses stepped on, or having their daily routines inconvenienced, might not have the warmest opinions about guts, and that's exactly what we see. Specifics about casualties are cited. There's deliberation about why the monster should be moved so quickly, and the potential consequences of the various options they could pursue. Law enforcement sets up a perimeter, and there are additional personnel to support Guts officers, very different from a lot of the older shows, where the immediate defense team seemed responsible for everything. These are details that complement the simulation-like approach, and desire to highlight the impact of monsters on a world such as our own, a world where monsters are still extraordinary, and such intrigue is at the forefront of the show's interest. It's also a move from the wackier sensibilities that the Ultra series embraced in the 70s. Of course, he alone cannot be credited for the realism or focus of this episode, much less the show. However, Kawasaki does an excellent job with the material, and even makes his own valuable contributions. For example, details about the effects of the smell, such as it putting people into critical condition, was Kawasaki's idea, and a potentially sensitive one at that. Why? The 1995 Tokyo subway siren attack. The domestic terrorist attack, which Japan was less than 2 years removed from at the time, involved cult members unleashing nerve gas within the Tokyo subway, killing over a dozen people and injuring thousands more. It remains the biggest terrorist incident in modern Japanese history, and is at least one reason why Japan doesn't really have public trash cans today. But I digress. Point is, according to Kawasaki, there were attempts to talk him out of including what could be read as an allusion to the attack. Nevertheless, undoubtedly familiar with the long history of Tokusatsu, drawing on contemporary terrible events, he held course. And it wasn't the only edit he made. The episode's humorous exchange between Hori and Shinjo was another Kawasaki addition.
そんなことより細胞のサンプルを採取だろ。分かってまんがな。 こいつ鼻がバカになってるちゃうか。
何がバカだって？
ああ、耳はええねや。
It was a move motivated by his desire to combat what he felt had been limited characterization up to that point, especially between the characters in question. Finally, the comedic note on which the episode ends was another Kawasaki contribution, and was something done without Konaka's permission.
怪獣災害が頻発するこの日本の苦境の中で、我々が一つ幸運と言えるのは、優れた戦略家を要するガッツが我々を守っているということである。一市民として感謝を捧げたいと思う。
宗像は酒が飲めなかった。
Although Konaka was initially displeased about not being consulted, he was ultimately happy with the change, considering it a nice note on which to end the episode, and something that helped humanize the episode's lead character, Guts strategist and second-in-command, Munakata, who had been little more than stoic and work-oriented prior to that point. The changes made in episode 5 were the first of many times, and many ways, Kawasaki altered screenplays to meet his vision. And why is this a big deal? Well, based on comments Kawasaki made in a rather candid 2002 interview, writers typically have better relationships with producers, and thus are often higher on the food chain than directors in the Japanese TV industry. Still, despite the tension it seems to have caused behind the scenes, Kawasaki seemed to do a lot of what he wanted. Perhaps the most important example of both the powers writers held and Kawasaki's hands-on nature is episode 27, I Saw Obiko. In a script written by Iota, the first woman writer of the Heisei Ultra series, episode 27 tells the story of a sad spirit, troubled by the march of time, lashing out as the last traces of the past it loved are swept away. While demonizing urbanization might have been the expected route for it to take, the episode instead depicts change as inevitable, and encourages viewers to appreciate things while they have them. Elevated by Kawasaki's directing abilities, the episode manages a delicate balancing act of sharp tonal contrast, starting on a more humorous note, before masterfully, almost stealthily, shifting into a tearjerker in its latter half with his sympathy for the monster. In fact, the last fight isn't really a fight for Ultraman or Guts. They've taken to feeling sorry for Obiko, and only want to stop him from destroying the town in his fit of rage. Most of Ultraman's actions are evasive, or attempts at de-escalation. Ota's script originally had Tiga, at the urging of Reina, take Obiko to space in order to find peace. Conflicts being resolved with Ultraman taking a monster to space is nothing new to the Ultra series. Examples of this convenient, non-violent solution include episode 15 of the original 1966 series, a few episodes of Ultraman Taro, and episode 10 of Return of Ultraman.
ステゴンはな、宇宙へ行ったんだよ。
宇宙へ？
ああ。誰にも邪魔されず、冬眠できるってわけだ。
ステゴンが見えるわ。あれは星だよ。
However, Kawasaki had a few problems with this. 1. Obiko was not a space monster, and 2. Kawasaki felt Obiko getting banished from his home was a depressing thought. Furthermore, there's a cultural preference for dying in one's homeland. So, with that in mind, honoring that preference seemed appropriate since Obiko's main grievance concerned his home, that being an old Japanese village on the verge of losing the rest of its traditional identity. Consequently, Kawasaki changes the ending. Obiko, unable to accept that his village was not how he remembered it, and could never be again, baits Ultraman into killing him, and dies in Ultraman's arms. He dies on his own terms, on the eve before the final traces of the village he knew would be forever swept away. Following Obiko's death, in one last humanizing moment, Guts members speculate the reasoning behind his actions.
Obiko が町の人を怖がらせたのは自分のことを覚えててほしかったからじゃないのかな。
あの昔の村をオビコがずっと覚えてたみたいに。
According to Kawasaki, altering the end came at the cost of hours of negotiation and arguments. Nevertheless, they settled with something they both could agree on, and both later got to have their way elsewhere. Ota used her Monster Goes to Space ending in episode 32, and Kawasaki was given greater incentive to do his own thing, which resulted in him trying his hand at scripting, and brings us to what is widely considered his masterpiece, and the only episode of Ultraman Tiga he wrote. Episode 28, One Vanishing Moment. While the episode can be enjoyed on its own, it's worth having the context of the two episodes it builds upon, episode 6 and episode 15. Episode 6, Second Contact, is the start of a trilogy of episodes that tells an escalating, emotional story about the conflict between man and monster. As has often been the case in the art form, dating back to even the original Godzilla from 1954, man's scientific recklessness, or at least the unintended consequences of scientific progress, has resulted in a rampaging giant monster. What makes this trilogy special is how well it juggles sympathy for its monsters with a realistic, nuanced rejection of that sentiment. Starting with episode 6, let's take a look. In short, the electromagnetic radiation emissions of modern society have disturbed critters, a species which resides in the skies. This exposure has mutated them into the monster Gazort, which then descends from the heavens to wreak havoc upon mankind. In the first encounter with critters and Gazort, Hori makes an honest effort to bridge the gap between species, this despite losing his mentor to them earlier in the episode. But not only does Hori come to quickly realize diplomacy with critters is likely impossible due to incompatible existences. For example, critters have cannibalistic tendencies and consider friends to be food, but his attempts at bridging the gap nearly get him eaten.
友達はごちそう。
え？翻訳がうまくいってないんか？
友達はガゾートの食べ物。
何言うてんねん。
Next, while not to suggest it's the first episode to get emotional, or at least have a bittersweet resolution, because episodes 4 and 11 do these things first, Kawasaki's second attempt at critters in episode 15 is a hard-hitting ride with the most personal example of tragedy in the show up to that point. The episode builds upon foundations laid in other episodes. Specifically, it further fleshes out Guts member Shinjo and his sister, Mayumi, a nurse at TBC headquarters introduced back in episode 9 and seen again in the episodes to follow, like 10 and 11. Episode 15 has Mayumi lose her husband-to-be, Takuma, in Gazort's counterattack. Not only does it relate to the emotional reaction Shinjo had to other people losing loved ones back in episode 4, it gives the audience a chance to see Shinjo put in the same position. And there's the added punch of the tragedy happening to characters we know and have grown attached to, as opposed to the one-off victims of previous episodes. Takuma's death is a biting loss, and along with the siblings' initial efforts to deny the obvious but grim reality, there's heart-wrenching payoff to something set up in the same episode. Towards the start of the episode, Daigo makes a joke about Mayumi not being able to run and cry in her brother's arms forever, saying that it's natural for someone to come along and take Shinjo's place. And this is the note the episode ends on, Mayumi mourning in her brother's arms as Daigo, unable to do anything, watches silently in the distance.
お兄ちゃん。
The existence of critters and the reason they're a problem already puts humanity in a difficult spot. Not disturbing them requires a huge sacrifice. That sacrifice being a reduction and possibly elimination of an important part of modern life, electromagnetic radiation, which is involved in just about everything from satellite communication to cell phone use. And, within the universe of the show, is something that will supply humanity with limitless clean energy. So, when taking into account the bloodshed and devastation critters have caused, it's no surprise this conflict eventually reaches its breaking point. Bringing us back to episode 28. The threat of critters was supposed to end with episode 6. Konaka was satisfied with what had been done with them there, and episode 15 was meant to feature a new monster. It was even supposed to be a lovey-dovey episode, and not the tragedy it ended up being. Yet Kawasaki felt there was more to explore with critters, and that feeling persisted even after a second episode. So he pushed for a third outing. And although he directed the earlier episodes, they were both written by different writers, and, due to his mixed feelings about the previous attempts to explore the subject, this time he decided to write the script himself. So, with the freedom that afforded him, Kawasaki took the opportunity to paint a living world and build on points he was personally responsible for establishing in the first place. Past shows sometimes brought back characters, though this was mostly limited to the Ultras or monsters. Rarely was there a lot in the way of continuity and service of human characters in the world. Plus, the older shows often retcon things. Examples include the first couple of shows not initially existing in the same universe, and Terra's origin changing within his own show, and again in the movie. Long story short, early continuity was a mess. So, while the following examples will probably seem obvious or expected for serialized storytelling, Kawasaki was arguably one of the first to really get that ball rolling in this regard for Ultraman Tiga, and the Ultra series in general, especially for continuity across non-consecutive episodes. Anyway, with that said, let's start with Hori's souring opinion about critters. First, he expresses doubt in response to Reina comparing them to angels in the final moments of episode 6. This after learning they killed his mentor and he only barely escaped a similar fate. Then, in episode 15, Hori reminds others that Gazor eats people, a nice nod to continuity that both showcases Hori's changing attitude and heightens the stakes for the fight to come in the episode. Next, Kawasaki thought it important to revisit Mayumi after the loss of her lover, and ensure she had a believable progression in the aftermath of that traumatic event. Finally, back in episode 15, Guts Communications Officer Yasumi requested to join the fight. Here Kawasaki gives the character that opportunity, putting the zealous youth on the front lines to witness the ugliness of war firsthand. But anyway, with that context, time to really get into the last installment of the Critters trilogy. Episode 28, One Vanishing Moment. Humanity has decided enough is enough. Not only have there been the events of episodes 6 and 15, it is said a lot more has happened off screen in the time since, and Guts has been tasked to wipe out Critters once and for all. This operation is to be performed alongside another, an operation to deal with Jobari, the latest giant monster Japan has to contend with. Specifics are not provided about why the creature has suddenly appeared, though given the presence of a nearby residential area, it could be that human expansion has encroached on the domain of this creature, and ignited yet another conflict. These operations leave Guts divided about what the right course of action should be, and the ensuing debates constitutes the soul of the episode, affording the audience a chance to see how the main players have changed their positions towards Critters over the course of the trilogy, and ultimately see their individual positions on war and peace altogether. Hori's initial response to Critters was one of optimism. However, that goodwill has turned into pro-extermination sentiment, confident that coexistence isn't possible as humanity isn't going to radically change its course for the sake of a single species that has already caused so many problems. Shinjo, still bothered by the loss his family has suffered and wanting to prevent others from suffering the same fate, has similar feelings. Yazumi is shown to be a little too excited about the prospect of war and overconfident in its weapons, which draws attention to how war is nothing to take lightly, and highlights the paradox of protecting peace with an ever-growing amount and magnitude of power. But on the other hand, it also shows the need to have some ability to protect the ones you love. Reina has a more humane perspective, questioning what gives humanity the right to wipe out life forms it considers inconvenient to its way of life. It was human activity that started the conflict, and human activity that continues to perpetuate it. She wonders why Tiga is willing to protect us, and whether we're even worth protecting in the first place. Finally, Mayumi, in the aftermath of the tragic events of episode 15, has lost much of her happy-go-lucky attitude in favor of more solemn behavior and a staunch anti-war stance, fearing death while valuing life and love more than ever before.
平和今が平和お兄ちゃんたちが戦うのをやめれば神様も怪獣を出すのをやめるわきっと
In short, there's a lot of inquiry packed into 24 minutes of TV. It's perhaps some of the most overt and stimulating commentary as far as television efforts are concerned the art form had attempted in decades at that point. Possibly one of the better examples of it in Tokusatsu ever. And it ends on a bittersweet note that does not provide a lot of clear answers to these age-old questions. A few years after the episode aired, in an interview with Tokusatsu commentator Risaku Kiridoshi, Kawasaki shared some of his intent with the episode, alluding to the contentious 1999 NATO bombing of Yugoslavia. He questioned the logic and morality of might makes right, and it being the solution to everything. What was this bombing? NATO, led by the United States, in what some alleged was a violation of international law, conducted a months-long bombing campaign on Yugoslavia in response to the purported ethnic cleansing of the Albanian population that had been occurring there. Though, in the years since, some have alleged the situation was exaggerated or NATO had ulterior motives for their intervention. Kawasaki seemed to be among those critical of the bombing, saying, "If you maintain that might is right, you'd be like the America of today. If I don't like you, bombs away type logic there." But, if you think about it, against something like NATO forces, even small European countries wouldn't be willing to surrender. That's how the world is. You can't suppress things by force. And, relating it back to Ultraman, Kawasaki said, "In a world like this, to expect one hero to show up, beat some giant monster, and have everyone live happily ever after, that's pretty much just a lie. Fantasy. That is what I wanted to expose and critique with episode 28. I made it so that everyone had a legitimate point. That's why things were as messy and confused as they were." The hefty themes and ambiguous conclusion of episode 28 inspired comparisons to Hayao Miyazaki's Princess Mononoke, a 1997 Studio Ghibli anime film, which also dealt with the conflict between the development of civilization and preservation of nature. In addition to concluding on an open-ended note, it's an interesting comparison seeing how the Tiga episode predates the Studio Ghibli film by about 4 months, and was spoken of in the same breath as acclaimed cinema. Also worth noting is that, according to Kawasaki and Ultraman Tiga producer Masato Oida, episode 28 sparked controversy. Why? Detractors believe its subject matter to have been out of place, too grim for the Ultra series. But drama stirred behind the scenes as well. Some members of the staff considered the episode too heavy for the middle of the show, arguing that it felt more like a finale, and tried to talk Kawasaki out of it. Yet again, Kawasaki held his course, and it wouldn't be the last time he tackled heavy subject matter either. His last 2 episodes continue with comparable intrigue. While he didn't write it himself, Kawasaki's penultimate outing for Tiga was tailor-made for him, Written by Shinsuke Onishi, a university colleague Kawasaki brought into the industry to pen the episode, Episode 38, The Mirage Monster, depicts militarism taken to the extreme, featuring a rogue TPC official who on paper has a stellar record, aka someone we're supposed to be able to trust, abusing his authority and manipulating the masses with false reporting in order to gather data on how civilians react to monsters in a controlled environment. Captain Irma is put into a morally compromising position, and the episode demonstrates how easily rot can corrupt a larger force. Eventually, the episode gets into territory most famously covered by Ultraman 80, suggesting monsters can be born of negative human emotions. And with that, we reach Kawasaki's last episode, Episode 39, Dear Mr. Ultraman. The idea was conceived early in the show's run by Keiichi Hasegawa, and was something intended for Shingo Matsubara to direct. But, due to Matsubara's busy schedule, and believing that the episode would look silly after the evil Tiga saga, Hasegawa turned to his old university rival, Kawasaki, and it's hard to imagine anyone else having done the job as well. The episode revolves around the disgruntled psychic, Kirino Makio, whose experience with superhuman abilities has been far less positive than the admiration he feels Daigo has enjoyed as Ultraman. Kirino was discriminated against in his youth, treated as a monster because of his supernatural abilities. Disgusted with the love and attention that Ultraman has been showered with, he blackmails Daigo into playing a game with him, a game that will end with Kirino revealing Daigo's identity to the world if Daigo loses, potentially condemning Daigo to the same fate Kirino suffered as a child. However, Kirino does not realize Daigo's experience hasn't been perfect either. He does not understand the weight, or loneliness, of Daigo's burden. But, once witnessing Daigo's selflessness and positive nature in the face of borderline hopeless adversity, Kirino has a change of heart. He regains his faith in humanity, refuses to let his unfortunate past continue to define his future, and helps Daigo take down the monster of the week. Kawasaki's last 3 episodes are all examinations of heroism, who these heroes are, what makes them heroes, and what is the cost of their heroics. It's something that sometimes makes the heroes of these shows look less heroic in the process, but it's a fascinating subject that captures the realism Kawasaki sought. One could even argue it's something that traces back at least as far as episode 16, as the Kawasaki directed episode was the first of the show to really get into Daigo's loneliness and the personal consequences of the life he leads. But, in a glimpse of the competing creative ideologies behind the scenes, it is positive a few episodes later, in episode 20, that Daigo is not alone in his struggles. A sharp contrast to the possibilities raised in episode 16, where it is suggested that solitude and heroism are inseparable bedfellows.
つわものは常に孤独だと。孤独。つわものは勝ち続けなければならない。そのために孤独になると。
耐えられるかな。
But what are ideas without execution? And Kawasaki proves himself quite capable in this regard from the start. Not only is episode 5 one of Tiga's first great episodes, Kawasaki manages this despite the massive shoes to fill. What he didn't know at first was that this episode was based on the Jisoji directed episode 34 of the original Ultraman series. The episode is a hilarious simulation-like affair that includes memorable moments, like Captain Muramatsu putting his uniform on backwards, and Hayata mistaking a spoon for his transformation device. Another excellent example of Kawasaki's comedic chops is episode 16, The Revived Demon. When a group of thieves vandalize an ancient mountain monument, they accidentally unleash a vengeful demon, eager to wreak havoc upon the world once again. As a result, the ancient warrior responsible for sealing away the demon in the first place, now working through the body of one of the thieves who reawakened it, joins forces with Daigo to stop the demon before it's too late. The Revived Demon is a fantastic episode that traffics heavily in traditional Japanese imagery, has Kawasaki's most blatant emulation of Jisoji-style visuals ever, boasts a monochrome filter that shrouds the mountain as the demon regains strength, features a lot of creative shifting back and forth between the actor playing the thief and the spirit possessing his character, and is full of what is easily Kawasaki's best turns at comedy at that point. Examples of that comedy include the visual gags in Guts HQ, such as the amusing interactions happening between Yazumi and Shinjo, and the last instance of what had been a recurring gag present in the last 3 of Kawasaki's episodes, Daigo suffering from an injured left arm or hand. While Kawasaki was already pretty hands-on from the start, it wasn't long before he branched out into other duties, assuming even greater control over the episodes he directed, likely stemming from creative differences with Chiaki Konaga during their second collaboration, that being episode 6. Kawasaki was paired with other writers. It's probably also safe to say Kawasaki was not pleased with the special effects in episode 6 either, because 1. It has some of the least convincing moments in the entire show, something the same effects director would repeat in later episodes. And 2, Kawasaki opted to take matters into his own hands from that point forward. Why does that matter? Well, drama, the scenes involving humans, and special effects, the scenes with men in rubber suits stomping on miniatures, were traditionally handled by 2 separate units for much of Tokusatsu history. Each unit had its own director, and that director had their own team. While there are exceptions here and there, this was a common practice dating back to even many of the early Godzilla films, where the drama scenes were normally directed by Ishiro Honda, and the special effects scenes were directed by Eiji Tsuburaya. But back to Ultraman Tiga. Kawasaki's first steps into special effects direction were supported by effects veteran Koichi Takano. Takano was the primary special effects director for many of the classic Ultra shows, and Ultraman 80 was his swan song in that capacity. However, the old man was called upon to inaugurate a new era of Ultraman by directing the special effects for Tiga's first 2 episodes, and he later co-directed when needed, like assisting Kawasaki with episodes 15 and 16. Presumably, Kawasaki didn't need help for long, as he took a big step with his next outing, episode 27, directing both the drama and special effects on his own. While that has become commonplace nowadays, there were only a handful of examples of that at the time. But Kawasaki was only getting started, as he really made history with his next episode, episode 28, which marked the first time an Ultra series director was officially and completely responsible for writing, directing, and special effects direction. Writing was usually its own thing in Tokusatsu. It was rare that a director had even as much as a co-writing credit. So, Kawasaki juggling all 3 roles was a very unique achievement, and is still somewhat unique to this day. Furthermore, episode 28 is where Kawasaki starts truly cementing his own style of direction. It's here where it really becomes possible to see that Kawasaki favors top-down camera angles, often where the camera is placed at the roof, looking down on all Guts members having a meeting. And he also sprinkles in moments of handheld, documentary-like filmmaking. This episode is also where Kawasaki starts to better sell the illusion that pilots are actually in the Guts wings, beyond the usual cockpit shots. Typically, a scene involving a ride mecha will go from outside of the vehicle and then into the cockpit, or vice versa. However, unless memory fails me, starting with episode 28, Kawasaki started offering more dynamic moments where we see the pilots inside their aircraft, from the outside, and more of the surrounding environment than usual, taking advantage of the technological advances since the earlier days of the Ultra series. Though, if we're to include films, Ultraman Zerth beat Kawasaki to the punch with something similar, several months earlier. But, whether or not he was the first in the overall series to do it, Kawasaki employs the practice extensively once he starts. His examples are among the most visually complex of it at this point in the overall series, and it catches the eye because there wasn't a lot of this elsewhere in Ultraman Tiga. Another example of something Kawasaki enjoyed doing, but not present in episode 28, is having an enemy shoot Ultraman Tiga in the face at point-blank range and sending him flying back. Finally, while there's not much of it in this episode either, in virtually all of his other episodes, Kawasaki likes to show characters eating or drinking, and he was the first Ultraman Tiga director to do it. Once you see it, it's hard to ignore. But anyway, back to elements in episode 28. What episode 28 does have is thoughtful visual storytelling, and that's something done perhaps most notably with its emphasis on tanks, a deliberate move meant to make the action as relatable as possible, to sell the idea that this is something that could happen close to home. There's shots of tanks rolling through a suburban setting, later crushing flowers as they rush away in retreat. And, after a humbling defeat, there are shots of burned out tanks, almost certainly filled with the remains of personnel who couldn't escape in time, in addition to stressing the ugliness of war without a word being said, and reminding viewers that giant monster rampages, and wars in general, are not victimless affairs. It provides an answer to Yazumi's question from earlier in the episode.
Oi, Yazumi.
The triumphant military march music leading into battle has been replaced by something far less exhilarating, much like the reality Yazumi is faced with. On the note of music, one final point to mention about episode 28 is the use of Take Me Higher during the climax. Take Me Higher is the opening song of the show, and, usually in various instrumental forms, had already been used several times during the final battles of earlier episodes. That includes Kawasaki's use of it back in episode 6, but, displeased with said use, Kawasaki gave it a second shot, and its use here won him a lot of praise. Before turning into Ultraman to confront the monster on the loose, Daigo is already questioning his purpose for fighting, a continuation of questions from earlier in the episode, and in the midst of battle, those questions linger. But, once deciding he fights for his friends, those he loves, the music swells and erupts into intense guitaring as Tiga wipes out the monster with a burst of crimson energy from his body. As epic as it might seem at first glance, it is also laden with a sense of sadness, as if Tiga and Guts have possibly made a mistake, and the music gradually fades as the scene switches to the revelation that critters are leaving Earth. Openings to shows have been used during fights a million times before in the Ultra series. But what episode 28 did was something really special. Anyway, this brings us to episode 38, an episode which seems to draw inspiration from the editing of Ultra 7 episode 34, The Vanishing City, as can be seen in the repeated drum beat transition throughout both episodes. Drumming is also used for the moment when tension peaks, and Captain Iruma can no longer bear to maintain the lie she was ordered to keep, as she watches her team and the city descend into chaos.
おはよう。遅くなったわ。
隊長、さっきから通報がひっきりなしです。やっぱり何かありますよ。偶然の範囲を超えてます。刑務局のパトロールが出ていますが。錯覚ですよ。いや、錯覚にしちゃってそれを起こさせる何かの存在がきっとあると思うんです。
そうよ。そうじゃなきゃ。
だけど調査結果だって見落としたってこともあるわな。
さっきまでお前疑ってたじゃないか。
進歩するのは人間や。
待って。
Next, in addition to an effective use of Vivaldi's The Four Seasons, Kawasaki finds a rather captivating way to capture a meeting between Iruma and her superior. The most compelling of the camera work and editing is towards the end of the scene, where it bounces back and forth between trucking shots and close-ups. For the trucking shots, or the parts with the horizontal movement, the camera gets further away with each cut back, while the close-ups of Captain Iruma has the camera closer towards her face each time it returns to her. But that's plenty said about that episode. Let's get to Kawasaki's last episode, episode 39, where his directing won him comparisons to cinematic contemporaries like Shunji Iwai, an acclaimed Japanese director who was at the time best known for 1995's Love Letter, and Wong Kar-wai, a beloved Hong Kong director who was at the time best known for 1994's Chungking Express. Whether or not such comparisons were warranted is one thing. Still, it's interesting that such discussions came up, and Kawasaki does a lot of interesting things here. For something that might grab the attention of Ultra Series fans, there are select elements that feel reminiscent of Return of Ultraman, episode 33, The Monster Tamer and the Boy. The two episodes already have a few curious points in common. For one, as established earlier, Kirino was bullied as a child because of his psychic abilities. The same is true for Ryo, the titular boy of the aforementioned Return of Ultraman episode, who was bullied in part because people believe he has psychic abilities. Next, the sometimes rainy, sometimes somber aesthetic of scenes involving Kirino's past and loneliness recalls the moodier visuals of the famous Return of Ultraman episode. But if that wasn't enough, both characters can be seen visiting a bread shop in their respective episodes. For other highlights from Ultraman Tiga's 39th episode, there's the final battle, which includes inspired storytelling like the cross-cutting between Ultraman getting beaten and the memories of Kirino getting bullied as a child. It takes a while for it to move him, silently watching with the fight reflected in his glasses. But watching Ultraman suffer reminds Kirino of how he felt getting bullied as a child. And, despite his initial belief that Ultraman's suffering would make things right, it makes him feel guilty, and inspires his change of heart. Other examples of creative direction are the meetings between Daigo and Kirino. The first has an interesting use of low frame rates and blur effects for the passing crowd while keeping Daigo and Kirino at a normal speed and vision, which distinguishes them as superhuman individuals in a sea of ordinary people. The second conversation, set at an empty horse race track, takes things even further. The combination of camera angles and editing, and the experimentation with space conveys the tension between the two superhuman opponents. The most eccentric visuals are reserved for Kirino, who comes across as erratic and threatening, almost popping across the screen at will. One final thing I'd like to note is something minor, yet interesting nonetheless, and that is Kawasaki's fascination with the rotating table in Guts HQ. He wasn't the first to use it. It was put to use as far back as the first episode, though there is more basic than anything. Kawasaki first used it in episode 15, allowing each member to make a comment or gesture as they went in and out of frame. He used it again in episode 27 to humorous effect. But its use in episode 39 is the most interesting of the bunch. As Kirino monologues, something only Daigo can hear, and it's him thinking back on the email Kirino sent. The entire team moves across frame, and the camera zooms in, until only a conflicted Daigo and Reina, the only one to notice Daigo's conflict, are left in frame. Like I said, it's something minor, yet it represents Kawasaki's tendency to experiment and push himself, often revisiting an idea or subject until he's satisfied, which is probably a good summary of his efforts on Ultraman Tiga altogether. There's probably even a good argument that his ambition, especially his efforts early on, inspired his fellow writers and directors to continually challenge themselves, helping to take Ultraman Tiga to places the Ultra series had never been before. Prior to Ultraman Tiga, the Ultra series had explored serious subjects in indistinguished manners on more than a few occasions. There's the human cost of scientific progress from episode 23 of Ultraman. There's the arms race commentary of episode 26 of Ultra 7. And there's the discrimination allegory in episode 33 of Return of Ultraman. They all come to mind as early shining examples of the thoughtfulness the Ultra series is capable of. But aside from maybe Ultra 7, those are often the exception and not the norm. And in the almost 30 years since Ultra 7's debut, nothing approached its consistency and challenging convention, and leaving viewers thinking like Ultraman Tiga did, and Kawasaki was one of the key figures in making that happen. It's at least something people seem to have noticed at the time, seeing how Kawasaki received special attention from both viewers at home and those involved with the show. An example of the latter is a comment by Akitoshi Otaki, who played Manakata. During an interview a few years after the show, Otaki said, "Kyota Kawasaki is really good. From Second Contact to A Fleeting Dream in Ultraman Dyna, his episodes just kept getting better and better. I saw episode 28 and figured that it was about the extent of his talents. But watching episodes 38 and 39 made me think he was really good. It made me wonder where his peak actually would be, where he'd go from here. If we had a production company that allowed someone like him to make more and more films, we'd have some seriously great works to enjoy. I'm sure that if we could make more of a setting from which young directors like him can excel, Japanese cinema would evolve in greater ways." Of course, Kawasaki alone didn't make Ultraman Tiga special. There were a number of other talented writers, directors, and personnel attached to the series. And of course, there were excellent episodes without Kawasaki's involvement. Episodes like 17, The Battle Between Red and Blue, episode 25, The Devil's Judgment, as well as episode 43, The Land Shark, and episode 44, Inheritance of Shadow, aka the two-parter known as the Evil Tiga Saga. It was the combined efforts of the men and women behind the scenes who sought to prove the value of the art form that helped make Ultraman Tiga the most popular Ultra series show of the past few decades, and the first TV tokusatsu to win a Seiyu Award, an annual Japanese award that has celebrated the best in science fiction media since 1970. Furthermore, Ultraman Tiga was the third overall Japanese giant monster media to win the award, following in the footsteps of the first two 90s Gamera films, and it remains among the handful to have achieved such honor. In short, Ultraman Tiga was a big hit, its success properly reviving the Ultra series for a new generation and helped jumpstart an exciting new era of tokusatsu, the fourth tokusatsu, which would soon see other major events like a proper revival of Kamen Rider, which again is a story for another day. But it's not all great news, as besides minor roles here and there, like directing 2 episodes of Ultraman Dyna in 1998 and 2 episodes of Bioplanet Wu in 2006, Kyota Kawasaki essentially disappeared after Ultraman Tiga. There's plenty of smoke to speculate what might have happened, but that's not important. What matters is the rich legacy he left in his short, yet important time within the tokusatsu industry, and that legacy could use more attention. First and foremost, a special thanks to my patrons: Austin Trench, Nick Lenz, Eric Gonzalez, Puppy Buds, Brandon DeReal, Monkey Pant, Michael Stevens, and a huge thanks to Zealous Fervor. You guys mean a lot. I couldn't do this without you. And for everyone, what do you think of Ultraman Tiga? What is your favorite episode directed by Kawasaki? Or what's your favorite Ultraman Tiga episode in general? Which Ultra-related subject should be covered next? Be sure to share your thoughts in the comment section below. And as always, if you want to see more videos like this, please consider giving this video a thumbs up and subbing to the channel. That's all for now, but I hope to see you next time. So until then, take care.